Hello everybody. Today I'm going to do a video on dark academia. Now, dark academia is something that has been around for a good while, but it's a phenomenon that completely passed me by simply because I'm not really on TikTok. Actually, I'm not on TikTok at all. I'm not on Tumblr and I'm not on Instagram. And I only found out about the phenomenon that is dark academia on BookTube. Now, what is dark academia? Well, dark academia is, on the one hand, an aesthetic that is inspired by the hallowed halls of white higher education, like Oxford, like Cambridge, some of the Ivy League universities in the United States, mainly male, upper class, young people going to university, usually studying humanities, arts, mostly classics as well, and basically not having a care in the world because they will never have to worry about money. So it's not about people who study STEM at all or, want to actually contribute to society, but it's a different echelon of people. With regard to clothing, it's quite often vintage, it's quite often tweed, it's quite often muted colors. And interestingly enough, that's totally me because I usually wear muted colors. I also have tweed clothes that I wear, not at the moment. But it also involves certain things like spending long hours in libraries, working away, writing with fountain pens, which is actually something that I do a lot. I also have an inkwell here, which is fairly well used at this stage. So yes, apparently it also involves people running around with ink stains on their fingers. I've been known to do that. And with regard to culture, popular culture, it's books that basically cultivate this storytelling, but also films like, for example, Dead Poets Society, in my opinion, also Heathers. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the phenomenon when it comes to literature, because dark academia is basically easy to pinpoint when you look at certain, let's say, when you look at certain hallmarks. For example, they all share an academic setting. Here, the word academia plays an important role. You usually have a tightly knit in-group, and an outsider comes and goes into this group. They could be different in class, they could be different in background, they may be different, maybe even in the way they look. It could be an ethnicity thing, it could be a religious thing. There is some kind of obsession at work, quite often with learning itself. So people learning for learning's sake, not necessarily learning because they want to teach or make the world better, improve it, but basically just to learn in order to know more. Then, of course, there is usually death. It may be that one of the in-group is killed by other members of said in-group, or it could be that it's an outsider that gets killed. But usually there is death involved, and the in-group is trying to kind of obfuscate what's going on, maybe even detract people from investigating this. Then there is the supernatural or the occult, which quite often plays a role. And lastly, it's kind of a critique of the status quo. So the fact that this in-group exists, the fact that this in-group has a tight hold on power is critiqued. And I have brought a couple of books with me. At the moment, these are the ones that I have. There is also another one which I would like to add, which I saw in a different video, because as I was listening to people talking about dark academia, I went through my head and through the books that I've read in the last, I don't know, since I was 6 years old, I guess. And some of the books that are mentioned when we talk about dark academia were complete news to me. I'd never heard of Donna Tartt. I'd never heard of Leigh Bardugo, and I've changed all that. But then there were books that I had read which were missing from the lists that people basically have put out on the internet. So one of the books that is quite often mentioned and that is quite old is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I can understand why some people put it in the group of dark academia. I would not actually put it there because it's missing most of the hallmarks. There is no academic setting. There is no tightly knit in group. There is no outsider coming in. There is a lot of occult stuff. There is definitely obsession with youth and beauty. There is death or destruction that is brought about by Dorian Gray. He's a very destructive personality. It's definitely supernatural. And it is kind of a critique of this idea that society wants you to be young and beautiful. Even back then, that was what society wanted. There is also a book called The Likeness, which is by Tana French. She is an American author who writes crime stories set in Dublin. And in this particular book, the protagonist is a member of the Dublin Crime Squad, and she investigates the murder of a young woman who looks exactly like her. This young girl is young girl. She's in her 20s. She's found dead, and basically she has lived with a group of young students from one of the colleges or universities in Dublin. And they kind of live a little bit outside of Dublin in a really beautiful house. If you've lived in Ireland as I have, I lived in Ireland at the time when this book is set, and I can tell you it is spot on when it comes to describing what I call the Celtic tiger cubs. So the children that started university who basically grew up in Celtic Tiger Ireland, so before the bust in 2008, where by which time Ireland had lost all measure. Basically, Ireland was going completely crazy, spending, everything was spiraling out of control. But these were the kids whose parents might have come from hardship and one of the many busts that Ireland has gone through in its history, but suddenly became rich because Ireland became rich very, very quickly. And this group of kids, the cubs, the Celtic tiger cubs, have a certain way of behaving, which is very, very well described in this book. And you have the tight-knit group of students. This outsider comes in. She pretends to be somebody else, namely the girl that's died, and she's trying to uncover what's going on there. And the dynamic in there is incredible. There is no occult stuff going on, but there is academia going on in terms of that all of these guys go to and girls go to university. Interestingly enough, I only found one video that mentioned it. So basically, I've brought a couple of books with me which are considered dark academia, kind of like run-of-the-mill, and everyone will mention them. We've got The Secret Society by Donna Tartt, which was written in 1992. A lot of people think that this is basically the original idea of dark academia. I will dispute this in a second because I think that there's a book that was written in 1980 which is almost the father of all of these dark academia books. We have If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio, which I haven't read, but apparently it's like The Secret History, only redone. And some people say she plagiarized Donna Tartt. I can't tell you if she did. I would be very careful saying this. But the stories are similar in that in this book, it's a group of thespians who are into Shakespeare, and it's related to Hamlet. And in this book, it's a group of classics students who study Greek. Then we have Babel by R.F. Kuang, which is dark academia with a twist in terms of it's the only book of the books that I have just shown you and will show you over the course of this video that is written by a non-white person, or POC. So, because this is one of the issues that some critics have with dark academia, that it seems like it's mainly written by white people, and it concentrates on white people in an academic setting, which could, of course, cement the stereotype that academia is for whites only, which, of course, it isn't. Now, lots of people say, well, is it Babel, is it Babel? In my opinion, it can only be Babel because it's only got one B, and it's also spelled Babel like the Tower of Babel, which, of course, is a Christian myth from the Bible, and it has to do with language. And this book is very much about language and translation. And the magic system in this book is based on translation. So for me, as a linguist, this is a very interesting premise. I'm really looking forward to reading this. I haven't yet, but even the premise is already interesting to me. Then we've got Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo, which is the second part of the Alex Stern trilogy, apparently, because I was watching a video with an interview with Leigh Bardugo, and she said that she wants to write a trilogy. So she said in the beginning she thought she was going to write a huge epic, but now she said she wants to stop at 3. So this is number 2. Number 1 is in the next room. I thought I had it on my desk. I don't. I'm not going to get up. But the first one is, of course, Ninth House, which I've already read, and it's brilliant. But now I would like to posit that this book, and this is the German version, by Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose, written and published in 1980, is the original modern dark academia book. And why is that? Well, for those of you who know about the book, you can now skip. For those of you who don't know about the book, I'm going to give you a synopsis of it. In this book, it's set in the 14th century, so that's pre-Reformation, and of course pre-Columbian Europe. You have a huge problem in the Catholic Church, and that is that, and this problem actually will become worse and worse, and then later on lead to Reformation and Martin Luther deciding that there needs to be some change. Basically, at the time that this book is set, we have a pope in Avignon. So we have 2 popes at this stage. We've got one in Rome, we've got one in Avignon. There is a huge debate about poverty in the church, what the true meaning of the faith is, what the true meaning of Christ is, and so on and so forth. And you have very many small groups, and some of them not so small, appearing all around Europe that basically say we have to turn back, we're losing the truth of the faith. We are moving away from the story and the preachings of Jesus, and so on and so forth. And during that time, there was a huge debate, and the church was actually criticized by many, many different groups, but the church was still, of course, all powerful. And the church did use its power and basically burned so-called heretics. And we're not talking about witches, we're talking about heretics, people who basically say, I do not agree with what you're saying. There is no such thing as freedom of speech. There's no such thing as freedom of religion and of faith. If you oppose the Catholic Church, you have a problem. And people go around and basically inquisitors try to find out and try to root out the people who criticize the church, and there are mass burnings. That's the backdrop in very few words and sentences of this book. Now, in this book, we have a a Franciscan monk named William of Baskerville. He's English, and his German Adlatus, Adson of Milk. So, and William is a very erudite man. He's read loads, and he is a Franciscan, which means that the Franciscans were very much into poverty, very much into Eucharist as the main source of religious and spiritual healing. And they were very much at odds with the Vatican and the Pope, or the popes, I should say, because the Vatican is many things, but it's never been poor. It's never been interested in the true teachings of Christ, at least in the eyes of the Franciscans. And there is a huge debate going on. And basically, the idea is that a delegation from the Pope is going to travel to a monastery which is run by Benedictine monks and is going to meet with William of Baskerville. And William of Baskerville may or may not be considered a heretic. So he is in danger in a way. He's in danger because he could be considered a heretic and then be basically, burnt at the stake. And basically, William and his adlatus traveled to this monastery. The monastery itself is fake. It doesn't exist, and Umberto Eco states so, but he describes a very interesting, very beautiful building in the mountains, very high up, and it's a very secluded place. And back then, although the universities had already started to emerge in the 13th century in Europe, church-run schools and church-run education was still the norm for most people. And even the, let's say, the more secular centers of learning, the universities still couldn't just function outside of the church's teachings. They could not refute Rome. They could not refute Christianity. They couldn't say, well, yes, you go and teach everybody the good book and we will just concentrate on the real stuff. They could not afford to do so, and they didn't. So this monastery is, like many monasteries at the time, a hoard of learning and a hoard of knowledge because it's got a huge library. And the library is actually one of the central parts and protagonists in this book. Yes, I'm talking about a building. The library is part of this cloister, of this monastery, and it is a protagonist in the book. And in this library, there are treasures untold because, of course, knowledge is power. And the church is very, very suspicious of the masses learning. So the idea that Tom, Dick, and Harry can start learning to read is, like beyond them. That's not a good idea. And also, everything is done in Latin because that's even a step removed from Tom, Dick, and Harry, who may only be speaking German or English. And even if we taught them how to read and write German and English, they would still not be able to understand the learned conversation because that's held in Latin. And when the two arrive, there are also other protagonists there of different provenance. There is one person who is a mystic, who's also considered a heretic, but who's basically kind of sort of made a deal so as not to get burnt at the stake. There is a lot of that going on, and a lot of that is discussed. Now, Umberto Eco himself was a professor of semiotics and a very erudite man. So he basically takes this also as an opportunity to show the reader the backdrop as a very oppressive and very dark force. The Catholic Church is an oppressive, dark force, which is very academic. Here we have the dark academia, definitely here. The setting itself is, of course, a center of learning because that's what this library is all about. It's all about learning. It's all about sending monks to this particular library to start copying works and then taking them home with them to their own monasteries. Because, of course, there was no printing press at the time. Everything was still being copied by hand. And so there are many, many monks in this book that come from abroad. There's one guy from Uppsala, which is in Sweden, and he comes to simply sit there and start copying books that the monastery in Uppsala doesn't have. And in turn, he brings books from the monastery in Uppsala that this particular monastery doesn't have. So they get copied while he is copying, and then he will take back his books that he brought and also the new books that he copied to go home and put them into his own library. So basically, that's how it worked at that time. And the tight-knit in-group is the group of monks that run the library. And there is the librarian, and then there is Jorge. Jorge is an ancient former librarian. He's blind at this stage, which is why he can't work as a librarian anymore. And it soon becomes clear that he is the spider in the web, because what happens is people start dying. Monks start dying. And that's where the death comes in. So people from that monastery, people who originally belonged to that monastery and are also kind of part of the in-group, maybe not of the innermost circle, but definitely of the in-group, start dying. Now, the outsider, William, is an outsider in two ways. Number one, he's literally an outsider because he's a foreigner. He's from England. This is set in Germany. Number two, he is not part of this monastery. And number three, he's also not part of the order, because this is a Benedictine monastery and he's a Franciscan. Now, the Franciscans are quite a young order. They were only founded, I want to say, 200 years before by Franciscus of Assisi. And they had a very different outlook on things than the Benedictines did. So he's a threefold outsider, and he comes in here, and he is a progressive person. The Franciscans at that time were considered progressive, and it becomes clear that there is something happening in the library, that there seems to be a book that people are trying to read. And as we go through the story, it becomes clearer and clearer that someone is trying to prevent people from reading this book. That's where the obsession comes in. It's the obsession about learning, about knowing things, but also the obsession with keeping it close to your chest, making a decision who is allowed to know what and who isn't, because that's also an obsession. And the occult or supernatural comes in because, first of all, this is very much steeped in religion, and depending on where you stand, any religion is also occult, because occult simply means that you're hiding something. Occultus means hidden from view. And a lot of the stuff that happens in the Catholic or Protestant churches, if you were an alien and you came to Earth, you would consider this very occult, Lots of stuff is simply weird. I mean, especially Catholicism, when you think about what happens at when people eat the host, they essentially eat the body of Christ. So transubstantiation is absolutely at the heart of Catholic rite. So the idea that you have this host and then the priest says a couple of words, which is almost like magic, or it is magic if you think about it, if you really believe in it, and then it's suddenly the body of Christ. I mean, that is like, you transmute one thing into something else. I mean, that's magic right there. And it is then also cloaked into the different horn signals that signal the apocalypse. So basically there are angels and they basically sound a horn in order to indicate that the apocalypse is nigh, and each of them has a particular image associated with it. So one guy drowns in a huge cauldron of blood. of pig's blood, because obviously they had been slaughtering pigs and they caught the pig's blood to make it into sausage, which is actually a delicacy. It's a really good and very hearty food, but of course, once the guy drowns in it, you have to waste it and you can't use it anymore. But basically, this is associated with one of the horns of the apocalypse that is blown, and so basically, you get all of this very mythical, very occult stories from the apocalypse of St. John. And William is not deterred. He is determined to find out what the hell is going on in this monastery. And he finds out what's going on. And what is going on is that there are two works by Aristotle. One deals with tragedy and one deals with comedy. And the work about tragedy, we know. We've seen it. We don't really. I mean, I've read up on it, and it's not necessarily a book as we would understand it. It seems more like it's lecture notes that we have that have come down to us. But the book about comedy, or the lecture notes, as it were, about comedy, are lost. We know that they existed at one point, but we've never seen it. The book is lost to us. Well, except for in this story where the book does exist. But the problem is that Jorge, the old librarian, the former librarian, believes that all the world is suffering and all the world needs to be a valley of tears. We should not be happy. We should not laugh. And there's, he says, Jesus never laughed. That's one of his tenets. Jesus never laughed. Jesus knew from the very beginning that he was going to die on the cross. And so he never laughed. And so we shouldn't either. And Aristotle is, of course, an ancient Greek philosopher. And for many, many centuries, the Catholic Church debated whether anything that was written before the coming of Christ, before God basically revealed himself one more time to the world, and the real Jesus and the real God and the real prophet came to us. If anything that was written before that time by the Gentiles, so the people who are not Christians, could even be considered acceptable and not of the devil, because if the people who wrote it have not been touched by Christ, are not Christians, they are heathens, therefore their works are not liked by God and therefore should be destroyed. I know that this sounds radical, but there was also a debate whether people who were born before Christ was born and therefore cannot be Christian and died before he died and therefore could never ever actually be received into the church because they couldn't be baptized because there was no Christian belief, there was no Christian baptism. If these people went straight to hell, because we learn, if you truly believe, that only Christians who have been baptized will not go to hell. Well, you have to do a couple of other things, but if you're not baptized, then that's it. And at the very beginning of Christianity, there was a school of thought that said, no, they will never see the light because they will walk in eternal darkness. Later on, that was changed to, if you didn't have a chance to actually become baptized, because when you were around, Jesus wasn't around yet, the Catholic Church didn't exist, there was no such thing as baptism, you're off the hook. You don't necessarily end up in hell. You may actually get a chance at resurrection when kingdom comes, that kind of thing. That's all academic, and it also depends on your viewpoint, but this is definitely the viewpoint of Jorge. Anything that isn't written by somebody who is Christian is damned anyway. But Jorge is kind of torn, because while it is not Christian and therefore shouldn't exist, it does. And it's in his library. So what do we do with this? First of all, it's not Christian. Secondly, it's about comedy. It's about laughter. It's about the light side of things. If there is no laughter and only hardship and sadness in the world, this shouldn't exist. So he decides to do the next best thing in his mind after destroying it, because he is reluctant to destroy it. So he doesn't actively destroy it. At least he hasn't done for a very long time. He will eat it in the end and therefore destroy it, and then everything will go up in flames and everything is destroyed anyway, and he dies in the flames of his own library. But he decides to hide it, and he hides it in a labyrinth, because this library is a labyrinth. And even just finding their way through the labyrinth, overcoming all of the traps that Jorge has set. At one point they see monsters, because there is some candles that are burning, and the incense that's being burned is actually has hallucinogenic qualities to it, and if you breathe them in, you start hallucinating. Then there are mirrors that basically distort the way you look, so that if you're already hallucinating and then you see yourself in a mirror, and it's one of those mirrors that makes you really tall and wide, you might really think, you know, in the flickering light of a candle, that you're seeing a monster. So in my opinion, this book has all hallmarks of dark academia. It's an academic setting, a monastery, which at that time were still the centers of learning, the tightly knit in-group, the Benedictine monks, especially the ones that guard the library, the outsider joining, William of Baskerville, the obsession with learning, but also with sadness, with making everyone miserable, with making sure that knowledge that you don't see as something that should be taught, that should be given to the masses, you keep this, that's your obsession. Death, of course, people die left, right, and center. There's also a young girl who will be later on burnt as a witch, so there's death there as well. Supernatural and occult. I mean, it's about the Catholic Church. You don't get much more occult than that. And there is some supernatural elements in terms of people are made to believe that the supernatural plays a role, that the angels of the apocalypse are coming down and are killing people. So that's very supernatural. And of course, it's a critique, because this book is not only a critique of the Catholic Church or the church or anyone really who uses knowledge to oppress people. And the critique is, you have this institution, and it's the Catholic Church, but you could also say it's modern academia. It's anyone who owns something that should be given to everybody. Knowledge should not be kept. Knowledge should be shared. And I mean, I think this is very topical, because at the moment we hear that there are books that are being pulled from libraries because somebody says, oh, nobody should be reading this, or especially not my kid should be reading it. And this is pretty much the same thing. Jorge decides that nobody should read the part about the comedy by Aristotle's work on poetry and poetics. So he just basically pulls it. He puts it away in his library and says, nobody's gonna get it. And if somebody is trying to read it, I'm gonna kill them. And so this is why I would say that The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, published in Italian in 1980 and then translated into very many languages, is the first dark academia book of the modern world. If we count books like The Picture of Dorian Gray, then of course we can go back into the 19th century. I honestly don't think that his book is, it's an excellent book. I've read it many times, but I don't think it's dark academia. So this is my first foray into dark academia, and I read this book in its German translation in 1987. So, and I've read it many times. I've also read a lot of secondary texts on it that discuss the backstory, that try to explain also how this whole thing fits into the history of the church in Europe and of Catholicism in Europe at the time. It explains, or the book texts explain a lot about those different little groupings that sprung up during the time, and of course that eventually led to the Reformation and then the establishment of the Protestant church, or churches, I should say. So that's all from me. The next book I'm going to discuss is Leigh Bardugo's Ninth House, and TLDR, If you don't want to watch it, I will give you my succinct critique of that book. If you like The Rivers of London, then, and if you liked Lisbeth Salander, you will love this book. Lisbeth Salander meets Rivers of London, moves to Yale, is able to see ghosts, and goes to university. That's what Leigh Bardugo's Ninth House tells me. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. I read it through in less than 3 days. It's a great work of literature, and I really enjoyed it, and I think you will too if you like The Rivers of London, can live with a Lisbeth Salander type, very grey protagonist, and like the idea of dark academia. So I'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye.